From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. This is where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start, as we always do, with a check on the markets. And joining us now is Kayleigh Line. So how are we doing today on this Monday, Kayleigh?
It's not a very pretty Monday, David, at least for the equity market specifically. Down across the board, where the brunt of the pain really is in those more richly valued tech stocks. The NASDAQ 100 is down by nearly 2 full percentage points. Where you're seeing the outperformance is in the more cyclically oriented areas of the market. The small caps actually eking out a gain here. The Russell 2000 up by about 0.2%. Broadly, what we're seeing is really that reflationary story continuing to charge ahead. We are seeing yields moving off the highs of the session, but still the 10-year yield is sitting at 1.34%, and those higher yields may be causing investors to question a bit about why the thesis is what it is for some of those richly valued stocks like Tesla, for example, which is why you're seeing a lot of selling pressure in some of those big tech names. But the other part of the reflationary trade, other than the bond market, is the commodity market. Really remarkable price action. You're seeing WTI crude climbing back above $60 a barrel. The futures up by about 3%. Copper, really interesting story in the London trade, rose above $9,000 a ton. That is the highest level since all the way back in 2011. The thesis there being with global growth picking up, demand will pick up, and that could actually lead to a supply shortfall and therefore higher prices. Even gold benefiting from the commodities rally, futures up by around 2%. The one exception, David, is in natural gas. As that energy crisis eases down in Texas, the market is rebalancing, unwinding a lot of the big surges that we saw last week. Natural gas futures down by nearly 6% in today's session, David.
Yeah, relief can't come too soon to Texas, I think it's fair to say. Thank you so much to Kayleigh Line for that report on the markets. I want to talk about the Congress now. The House Budget Committee today is going to be taking up the Biden $1.9 trillion stimulus bill with a full House vote expected on Friday. We welcome now a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. She is Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, Democrat of Florida. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Give us your take on where we are on this stimulus bill. Do you expect it to pass out of the House on Friday?
Great to be with you, David, and thanks for having me. I do expect the stimulus bill to pass out of the House on Friday. I think there are a few things that we still have to tie up the loose ends, but the reality is that we have got to provide additional relief to the American people as the pandemic continues to rage on. And then you're right to call it a stimulus bill because there are elements of it that not only provide relief, but also provide economic stimulus. And that's really important until we get to the other side of this pandemic.
What specifically will be helping your constituents back in Florida?
Well, there will be direct payment checks, so checks to folks put money in their pockets, but really one of the most important things is getting shots in arms. It's the most effective way to defeat the virus and end the pandemic. And so there are significant resources for vaccines and vaccine distribution. And I think that's a critical part of getting our economy back on track. When we can get a hold of this pandemic, people will be able to resume their normal lives and will be able to get the economy back on track. Additionally, I'm really proud to say that the employee retention tax credit, which I had gotten into the original CARES package as well as into the end of year package, will be extended to the end of 2021 in the current stimulus package. And that basically has the ability to help 6 million businesses retain workers and keep them tethered to their paychecks as well as to their health insurance. And those are really important things in the middle of a pandemic.
Congressman, you mentioned getting shots into arms. You've had some suggestions about how that's being allocated right now, the vaccine to the states, saying we should be taking into account the demographics of the state, not just doing a straight population-based. Explain your concern.
So here in Florida, we have the highest percentage of more mature Americans. And we know that this virus disproportionately affects more mature Americans. They have more severe consequences. And so it's really important that if we want to try to alleviate the pressure on the healthcare system, as well as save American lives, that we allocate the vaccines based on the percentage of more mature Americans that each state has. Right now, the formula holdover from the Trump administration simply allocates vaccines by population over the age of 18. And it disadvantages states like Florida that need to quickly vaccinate their seniors in order for them to be able to move on to other groups of people. So I'm hopeful the Biden administration will reevaluate the formula that is currently being used and address the needs of our most vulnerable Americans.
So here at Bloomberg, we pay a lot of attention to the markets and what the markets are telling us about the economy overall. There are some early indications, actually, we're heading back toward a hotter economy, something that Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, has said he wants. Should we be concerned about it at all? Are you, as a congressperson, concerned about that possibility? If not this time on this 1.9 trillion, then the next time, because we're told there's another big package coming down the pike.
I think given the economic impact that this virus and this pandemic has had on people, it's a risk worth taking and not really one that I'm too concerned about of overheating the economy. In fact, I was just down on the main street in my community and shop owners are still worried. They still don't see the foot traffic they need to make ends meet. There are still a lot of people who are still suffering, and especially in a community like Orlando, where we are heavily dependent on tourism and high touch industries where people gather, that hasn't come back yet. So I think we need to address this pandemic and the economic policies or economic consequences, both with speed and scale.
I want to turn to another part of your responsibility. As I say, you're on House Ways and Means Committee. You also now are on the Armed Services Committee, and you have a background having had a career in the Department of Defense. Give us a sense of what you think the big issues are for this administration right now with respect to foreign affairs and particularly military service.
I'm super excited to be back on the House Armed Services Committee and to be vice chair of Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee. I think it's really important that we address the range of threats that are facing the country in this moment. And we have seen threats coming in from our near peer adversaries. We have countries like Russia and China who are using hybrid warfare of sorts to attack our democracy. And we need to have a coordinated response to all of those types of things. And I think it's an exciting time because we have a Biden administration that understands, that America can't do this alone and that we have to do this with our military partners and our allies.
We just heard from President Biden last week in two major addresses, actually, involving foreign policy and the importance of relations, particularly with our allies in Europe, and the issue of China and of Russia as well. What can the Congress do to work with the Biden administration? We typically think of the executive branch we used to serve as taking the lead on foreign affairs.
Right. I used to be at the Department of Defense, and we often execute on that. But I think Congress has a real opportunity to help shape the strategy and the direction that we're going in. And I think the Biden administration has begun to signal to our allies that America is back at the table as a serious partner, and that we need to work together to defend our democratic values and our democratic interests, as well as defending American interests as it relates to the economy and trading. We have actors on the world stage who aren't willing to play by the rules of the multilateral institutions, and we need to work with our allies to bring those people into the fold so that they aren't cheating, whether it comes to cyber attacks or unfair trade practice.
Well, you mentioned cyber a couple of times now, Congressman. I'm really interested in that because we had that massive attack, as you know, through a supply chain issue with a private contractor that we still, I don't think, know fully what happened with that. What needs to be done? What would you advise the Biden administration, given your background, your expertise, what needs to be done to protect us more in cyber?
Yes, I think there's a lot that has to still be done as it relates to cyber. First, we have to really understand the full extent of that SolarWinds hack. But there have been numerous other cyber attacks against the United States, whether it was against our election systems or against our the backbone of infrastructure. And so we have to understand fully those attacks. And then we have to think about what are within our range of responses to hold these bad actors accountable. We can't allow them to attack our country without consequences. And so I think that there's a lot of work that we can do in this space to keep our country safe, to ensure that there is cybersecurity. Additionally, I know that the Biden administration is talking about securing our supply chains, and I think that that is a good thing. But we should not be as dependent on adversaries for our supplies. And that means that, it's not just about domesticating our supply chain, it's also about diversifying our supply chain. And that means working with our allies in our sourcing capabilities for highly sensitive technologies.
Congressman, it's always good to talk with you. Thank you for being here. That's Representative Stephanie Murphy, Democrat of Florida. Coming up here, getting the COVID vaccine to those who need it the most. We talk with Katherine Baicker. She's Dean of the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. A big loss for Donald Trump at the U.S. Supreme Court. Justices put a New York grand jury on the brink of getting 8 years of the former president's tax returns and other financial records. They rejected his bid to keep the information private. The investigation by Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. looms as one of Mr. Trump's biggest legal threats. President Biden is picking up where President Trump left off at the World Trade Organization. The U.S. delegation to the WTO is backing the Trump administration's decision to label Hong Kong exports as made in China. The Biden administration also will continue to block new members from joining the WTO's appellate body. Critics say both moves could undermine the international trading system. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is pledging to reopen England's stores and outdoor hospitality beginning in mid-April. Speaking to Parliament today, Prime Minister Johnson set out steps to carefully reopen the country, warning there would need to be at least 5 weeks between each to judge the impact on infections and deaths.
In step 2, non-essential retail will reopen, as will personal care, including hairdressers, I'm glad to say, and nail salons. Indoor leisure facilities such as gyms will reopen, as will holiday lets, but only for use by individuals or household groups.
Prime Minister Johnson's already facing pressure to move faster after the economy endured its worst recession in more than 300 years. In Indonesia, thousands of people have been evacuated due to the heavy flooding. Officials say more than 28,000 residents have been affected. Thousands of homes are covered with as much as 8 feet of water and are without power. Seasonal rains and high tides in recent days have caused dozens of landslides and widespread flooding in Indonesia. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. The push is on to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible, but there are some early indications that those most at risk are not getting the doses as fast as others are. We welcome now Katherine Baicker. She is Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. So, Dean Baicker, thank you so much for being back with us. Give us your sense about what is going on with this administration. I know certainly, for example, here in New York City, that in fact there's an under-indexing among African-American, Black Americans, as well as Hispanic Americans.
What we're seeing now is the result of the last year's worth of mixed messages about the efficacy of a vaccine and the importance of getting vaccinated, and also a disconnect between what's happening in a central government coordinated push versus what's being left to the states and the localities. That last mile of the vaccine is very hard for a lot of localities to manage, and having more centralized resources up and running might be really helpful in making sure that there's accessibility to the vaccine across the country.
Well, that's my question. Is there anything we can do about it at this point?
Well, I think it starts with more consistent messaging, starting at the top of the government and all the way down to local leaders about the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. And there's a little bit of a challenge in that we're telling people to continue to be careful after getting vaccinated, which is prudent on one level, but on the other hand, might suggest to people that it's not so important that they get vaccinated, which of course it is. So we need that consistent messaging across all levels of the government. And then we need to use the systems that are already in place to help deliver vaccines like the flu every year. Make sure that we're using all of those outlets to get the vaccine to people through hospitals, through drugstores, through employers. We need every mechanism available to us.
So we have the emergency of the pandemic now, which is going to be with us for a while longer. I wonder, though, do you foresee any long-term, even permanent changes in the way we administer healthcare in this system because of the way we've dealt with this pandemic?
That is such an important issue because, of course, everyone is very reasonably focused on treating COVID now and getting everyone vaccinated, but people are still having heart attacks and getting cancer and having babies, and thinking about the way that our healthcare system responds not only to a crisis like the pandemic, but also to the provision of routine care and maintenance of chronic health conditions. We're seeing right now the disparities in access to the healthcare system in an acute way for COVID, but that's the same disparity in access that we see to trying to treat populations with very different rates of diabetes and heart disease and cancer, and moving to a system with more equitable access, but also using tools like telemedicine much more effectively. That might be the silver lining of what's happened over the last year, is that we're finally using all of those tools to deliver care to under-resourced areas. We also need to think about how we're insuring people, and we've seen the consequences of lack of continuity of health insurance as well as access to health care.
So, Dean Baicker, I want to make a turn, but I think it's a very slight turn, actually, to what comes after the stimulus, the $1.9 trillion stimulus. Some of that money, of course, is going to go for vaccination. And that's the next package we're starting to hear about, and some talk about single-payer health being brought back in. You've written on that subject in the Journal of American Medical Association. Give us your concerns about single-payer.
Well, I think there's a really appealing aspect to making sure that everyone has access to at least a basic level of care. But single payer comes with a cost that I think is harder to perceive, which is people want very different things from their healthcare providers, from their health insurance. People live in parts of the country with very different provider networks and with very different health needs. And a one-size-fits-all single payer system risks forcing people into plans that don't really meet their needs. There are other ways to ensure that people have access to really vital healthcare services without forcing everyone into a cookie cutter plan. And I think there's some research that suggests that when you ask people what they want from their health insurance or from their healthcare providers, there's a lot of variation across the country. Everybody wants low-income populations, vulnerable populations to have access to healthcare, but they want their own health insurance to look a little different.
So, Katherine, you've worked at a pretty senior level with the government to try to help them figure out healthcare policy in the past. Do you have a sense right now, as they put together this package that we're told President Biden might want to announce in March when he gives that address to the joint session of Congress, about what they're thinking about doing, what might be in the package when it comes to healthcare?
There are a lot of incremental changes that would make a big difference in the lives of millions of Americans. Expanding Medicaid in states that haven't already expanded and making the income limits a little more flexible, while at the same time expanding subsidies for purchases through the health insurance exchanges, whether they're operated by the states or the federal government. That would open up multiple avenues for people who don't have health insurance right now to get it, particularly in the middle of an economic downturn where so many people who had their insurance through their jobs lost not only their jobs during the recession, but their access to health care. Those different mechanisms can help fill the gaps in people's access to health insurance. And then they could be coupled with innovative ways to pay for health care under health insurance plans to move us towards a higher value system.
Thank you so much. It's always good to talk with you. That's Katherine Baicker. She's Dean of University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Coming up here, Boeing gets grounded again, but this time because of an engine failure. Details ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Airlines around the world are grounding an older model of the Boeing 777 after that dramatic engine failure over Denver that happened over the weekend, making Boeing our stock of the hour. And to take us through what has happened, we welcome our expert in Boeing, and she is Brooke Sutherland of Bloomberg Opinion. Great to have you here, Brooke. So what from your perspective, what happened here?
I mean, certainly those images are really jarring. And I think that makes a lot of people nervous. And the early investigations from the NTSB indicate that there were broken fan blades, which helps explain why we saw, such a violent failure here. But I do think it's important to have some perspective. And, I think the instinct right now when anything goes wrong in aviation is to look at Boeing, considering the company's recent history, most significantly with the 737 MAX, but also, with production issues with the 787 in recent months. But in this case, it seems extremely unlikely that this is, in fact, a Boeing issue. The plane in question has been flying since the mid-1990s. And, any kind of structural issues that may have been in this airplane would have been unearthed by now. And it does seem that any kind of problem is contained to the engines, which are not manufactured by Boeing, but made by a business within Raytheon Technologies called Pratt & Whitney.
Yeah, so as a practical matter, does that have any longer-term implications, you think, for Boeing or for Pratt & Whitney, for that matter? Because it sounds like the airlines that might buy Boeing know what you just said. The regulators probably know what you just said. And I don't think they're making this engine anymore, are they, at Pratt & Whitney?
No, and so Boeing has actually signed an exclusive contract with GE to make engines for the newest version of the 777. Now, that plane, the first delivery has been pushed back to 2023, but in a weird way, this incident may actually end up helping Boeing in the longer term. Certainly, nobody wants to see something like this happen, but if these repairs that are required by the FAA end up being costly, some of these airlines might look at these older 777s and say, do we really need these? I mean, right now, there's not a lot of demand for international travel, and that's what these planes are primarily used for. I mean, I think it's notable that there are almost as many of these 777s with Pratt engines in storage right now as there are actually flying around the world. And if you see, a significant chunk of these planes put into permanent retirement, eventually you're going to have to replace those. We will get through this pandemic at some point. That international travel is going to come back. Yeah. And Boeing would be all too happy to sell new planes to airlines that might need them. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out long term, but it could end up being a benefit to Boeing.
Brooke, just very quickly, does it affect anybody in the aftermarket? That is, people who would be supplying parts or maintenance for these?
Yes. For Pratt & Whitney, this would be a headache, certainly. They are no longer making engines for the newest 777 plane, but they do get, a significant amount of money from aftermarket revenue. And so, any kind of issue like this is not helpful for them. And particularly if you do see a wave of retirements because of this, that takes away a revenue source for Pratt & Whitney. So that is a problem to keep an eye on, certainly.
Thank you so much for Bloomberg Opinions. Brooke Sutherland coming up next. We're going to talk about the Texas deep freeze and the energy markets with Stanford University engineering professor Sally Benson. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. President Biden's nominee for Attorney General says domestic terrorism is a greater threat than it has been for decades. This after the January 6th mob attack on the U.S. Capitol. Merrick Garland spoke before the Senate Judiciary Committee at his confirmation hearing today.
If confirmed, I will supervise the prosecution of white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, a heinous attack that sought to disrupt a cornerstone of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power to a newly elected government.
Judge Garland said the country is facing a more dangerous period than it did during the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Garland led the prosecution of the worst domestic attack in the U.S. The CEO of MyPillow has been named in a $1.3 billion defamation suit. Voting machine company Dominion Voting Systems accuses Mike Lindell of trying to boost sales by repeating Donald Trump's false claims about a vast election conspiracy. The suit says Lindell increased sales as much as 40% by repeating the claims on conservative media while pitching promotional codes for his products like Fight for Trump, 45, and QAnon. Democrats begin the final push for President Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus bill this week. All the talk of bipartisanship has now gone out the window. Democrats want to get the measure passed quickly before an earlier round of benefits runs out. The House plans to vote on Friday. The real action will be in private talks in the Senate. There, some Democrats are opposed to plans for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Global health officials say they're hopeful but cautious about the strides made against the coronavirus. World Health Organization Emergencies Chief Mike Ryan says the last 6 weeks have seen what he calls a positive decline in the spread of the virus worldwide. Still, speaking to Ireland's RTE Radio, Ryan cautioned against reopening too soon after lockdowns. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Life is slowly getting back to normal in Texas after the climate and energy disaster of last week. And now, besides replacing all the burst pipes and restoring full water supply, attention is going to turn to what happened and what can be done about it to make sure it doesn't happen again. We welcome now Sally Benson of Stanford University, where she is Professor of Energy Resources Engineering and Director of the Global Climate and Energy Project. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here. We hear a lot of people with the dog in the hunt, basically pointing fingers back and forth. Give us your sense about what went wrong.
Well, thank you very much. I think lots of things went wrong. I think that the system wasn't hardened to, deal with this extreme cold. I think that there was, very high demand for electric heating in an area that typically doesn't require a lot of heating. There was, things like, wind turbines that didn't have de-icing on them. So I think that fingers would be pointed in a lot of directions. But my perspective is that this is the consequence. This is the symptom of really potentially a larger issue that we see taking place as deregulation of the electricity system happens. In the old days, you had a regulated utility and a Public Utilities Commission that basically laid out certain performance standards for the grid that would assure reliability, things like resource adequacy, reserve margins, and all of that. And as we move towards further deregulation, exactly whose responsibility is that and who's monitoring that is becoming progressively unclear. And it's not just Texas. There are other places, with similar circumstances.
Well, that's the question, I guess. I mean, no business basically likes to be regulated, and deregulation can also be pro-competitive. At the same time, did they go too far here? Because normally you'd think the marketplace might take care of it. I think they were thinking that the profit motive would drive it, but that clearly was not enough, it appears.
Yeah, well, I think if we were in a situation where demand on the grid was stable, perhaps the Texas experiment would, be working out very well. Actually, it has worked out pretty well up until now. But in a world where the climate is changing quickly and how and when and where people use energy is changing quickly, it's not clear that the market can keep up quickly enough. Investing in energy infrastructure, is a decadal scale kind of investment. We just can't turn on a dime, and the changes we're seeing now are really quite quick. So we really need much more systems planning, systems integration, particularly as we're trying to integrate more and more renewable generation into the grid, which everybody knows. It's very low cost and it can be extremely reliable when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining, but those things always don't happen. So we need to figure out a way as we look to the future to avoid these circumstances by building in more guardrails for our electricity system.
So, Professor, address that issue quite specifically, because right out of the box early on, some people were coming on Bloomberg and elsewhere and saying the problem was overinvestment in renewables. And it wasn't so much because wind turbines froze because it didn't supply that much of the energy, but a lot of investment had gone into that, and therefore we had not invested in things like gas pipelines. Is there some fairness to that?
I think it's fair to say that a lot of attention is now directed at investing in renewables. That we need to go that way, and it can be done reliably, but you need a lot of system planning and system modeling, and everything needs to be built up in concert. So if you're adding renewables, well, then you need to make sure you have enough flexible natural gas capacity to provide load following, and you need to have enough storage to deal with peaking and so forth. So just adding any one component of the system, like storage or PV or more EV charging, we can't do it that way. This is a highly integrated system, and we need integrated systems planning, and we need to make sure that all of these things are moving in lockstep so we can get the environmental benefits, the economic benefits, but we need to plan for reliability, which I think needs to be the focus as we move into this energy transition.
Yeah, moving a lockstep in the right direction, presumably. Thank you so much. Really great to have you with us, Professor. That's Sally Benson. She is Professor of Energy Resources Engineering at Stanford University. Coming up here, where is the Republican Party headed? We hear from former GE CEO Jeff Immelt and from Republican candidate for New York City Mayor Sarah Tirschwell. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Jeff Immelt will be remembered as the CEO who presided over the steep decline of an American icon, that is General Electric. Now he's releasing a new book, Hot Seat, in which he tells his side of the story. But he's not just giving his successor advice, he's also giving the Republican Party a tip as it changes.
I'm a Romney Republican, so there's like 12 of us left. I think the principles of low regulation, economic growth, those are the things that I would like to see take place. But right now, Eric, I think for people that watch your show, we have to solve COVID right now. In other words, I think we can have debates about the last president, the current president, what they're thinking. Right now, there's one thing that's probably on the mind that's most important for everybody, and that's solving COVID. And that's what I'd like to see Republicans and Democrats alike, governors, everybody. Let's get people with the vaccine, and let's find a way to get the economy back on track. A non-answer answer, Eric.
Well, okay. Since you've acknowledged that you're giving me a non-answer answer, I'll press you a little bit further. You're right. COVID's a priority. But what we're talking about is the ideological soul of one of America's two, and there really are only two to speak of, political parties, of which you belong to one. And that's an important question, don't you think? It's a much more, we're going to be living with COVID for a long time, but we're also going to be living with this question. And I'd like to know how you think it could be, you'd like to see it resolved.
Look, I just think it's time for fresh ideas and new ideas in the party. Again, I think if you look back in time, let me just look back for a second. And you talked about it earlier, which is Milton Friedman, free markets. I think the old ideas of what it meant to be a Republican got stale, and they weren't replaced by new ideas. And what any party needs to do is find what are the right ideas for this decade, for not for me necessarily, but for my daughter, and speak to those. And I just think whether you're a company or a political party, or you're a small business or a big business or a leader or somebody that's working for a company, when you run out of ideas, that's a bad place to be.
You're now giving advice to other leaders as a venture capitalist at NEA. What's the question you get asked most often?
I break it down into two pieces. One is, how do I survive in the crisis I'm in right now? So every company, big and small, had to get through the last 9 months in some form of crisis leadership. And again, one of the reasons for the book is that all leadership is crisis leadership. So I talk about things like leaders absorb fear. Leaders can hold two truths at the same time, that things are going to be terrible, but things can be great. Let's take advantage of that. That you watch those around you in terms of who manages through crisis and who doesn't.
That, of course, was former GE CEO Jeff Immelt speaking with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker. Wherever the Republican Party heads next, it faces an uphill climb as it tries to take over New York City in this year's mayoral race. We welcome now one of the Republicans trying to do just that. She is Sarah Tirschwell. She's the chief financial officer of Foundation House, which provides mental health services to New Yorkers needing help. But before that, she spent 29 years in finance in New York, including at Davidson Kempner Capital Management and most recently at TCW. And we welcome her now to Bloomberg. So, Ms. Tirschwell, thank you so much for being here. Listening to Jeff Immelt there, it struck me, I think you may agree with him about quite a few things, given what you've said on your website and what I've heard you say.
I actually agree with him on a lot of things. One is that we need fresh new voices in the Republican Party. Second is we do need some regulatory reform, absolutely. And we actually need to do some soul searching as a party and figure out exactly, what our message is to the American people and how we are going to make the United States a better place to live for our children and our grandchildren.
You have the large issues of where the Republican Party faces. You also have some pretty big issues right here in New York City, because New York City is not in great shape. First and foremost, because of the pandemic, I think it's fair to say, but it has a lot of problems that go well beyond that. What would make the New York voter turn to you to try to fix that?
Well, I would say that New York City is in pretty dire financial straits. I think everybody recognizes that. My history is all in distressed finance, investing in troubled situations, which basically means, trying to figure out what is good about a situation, what's bad about a situation, what's worth keeping, what's not worth keeping, what can be changed and what can't be changed, and also identifying the fundamental reasons why a situation is distressed. And in New York City, there are a few very fundamental reasons why New York City is distressed. And they actually coincide with the very reasons why the voters are so angry, which is basically, I have this concept that I call regulatory inequality, which is that the regulatory regime in New York City has become so oppressive that it favors the haves versus the have-nots, and it raises the price of entry to anybody who wants to live here, relocate here, start a business here, operate a business here, and also how to educate their children here.
So you certainly have issues that you've talked about, particularly using small business as an engine for growth and the regulatory overhang on a lot of small business. At the same time, you have to have an environment where you want to live and you want to bring your children up. And there's a situation in the city actually having to do with safety. I mean, it's hurting our tourism business, for example, quite apart from the pandemic. We have a lot of crime problems in the country and the city. What would you do about those?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think that crime is the main thing keeping tourists from coming to New York City right now. I think COVID is the main thing keeping tourists from coming to New York City. But yes, we do absolutely have a crime problem, and that has to be fixed as kind of a baseline issue before fixing anything else. But crime is solvable. Crime is a matter of having a different mayor with different priorities and allocating resources differently to the problem. Crime, in my opinion, is the number one most easily solvable problem in New York City.
What about education? What needs to be done with respect to the public schools, particularly given the pandemic right now? Would you reopen the public schools, and how could you get that past the unions?
Absolutely. Well, I don't know how I could get that past the unions, but absolutely, the public schools should be open. I mean, you understand this issue of the charter schools that want to reopen but can't because they're leasing property from the city, which I think is just bureaucratic nonsense. We have to get schools reopened. I don't know how much you've read about my life story, but unfortunately, I have dealt with suicide up close, and it's a very personal issue to me. And the suicide rate has risen significantly across the country and also in New York City. We now have a mental health pandemic, frankly, amongst adolescents and teens in this country and in this city. And we need to, it is our responsibility to reopen schools. And I'm sorry, I know that people are scared, but part of the reason that people are so scared is because we have leadership who have, I think, instigated fear in the people of New York City. And secondly, they've done nothing to quell their fears about this, about, offering safety within the classroom or within the school.
So you do have a very sad story, personal story that I have read about, and you've really overcome an awful lot. Finally, I do want to ask you, this is Bloomberg, as you know, and we cover Wall Street a lot. A lot of investment companies, the ones you've worked for, in fact, including TCW. You're locked in litigation right now with CCW, where you're alleging, as I understand it, sexual harassment, really pretty awful sexual harassment against you. They're claiming you violated compliance rules. Give us a sense of where you are on that, and maybe as important, is it relevant to your run for mayor? Could you bring some of that experience into being mayor?
Okay, so I'm going to start backwards. So it's relevant because I think that there are lots of women who have encountered, harassment and gender discrimination on the job, not just on Wall Street, but on Main Street. And many of them, have not had the resources to be able to step out and stand up for themselves. And so in a sense, I am stepping out and standing up for them as well as myself. And I believe that also it makes people understand that I am not necessarily of the establishment just because I worked, in, an, establishment type industry for most of my career, that I was willing to stand up and fight against the establishment when I saw that they were doing something wrong.
Okay. I really appreciate you being here. That's Sarah Tirschwell. She's a Republican candidate for mayor of the city of New York. Coming up, President Biden is still trying to put his cabinet together. Our editor-at-large, Marty Schenker, is here with an update on where he is. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden still has a long way to go to fill his cabinet fully, with his Attorney General candidate Merrick Garland having his confirmation hearing today and his nominee for Interior Secretary Deb Haaland due up tomorrow. To take us through where we are, we welcome now Bloomberg Editor-at-Large. He's Marty Schenker. So, Marty, he's got quite a few holes left here. What's going on?
Well, I mean, the White House is standing by near attendant for OMB, but by all measures, it looks like her nomination is lost. Even though the White House still maintains they have a chance, with Mitt Romney and Susan Collins opposing, it's hard to see how they can reach across the aisle to get support for her.
Yeah, and that's because largely of some of her social media posts, right? That were I guess they were pretty personal about some Republicans and even some Democrats.
Yeah, she tweeted that Susan Collins was, quote unquote, the worst, among other things. But look, if we started vetting politicians by mean tweets, I don't know who we'd get to serve in government. That said, the idea that she deleted 1,000 or so tweets before her nomination even came to the Congress is not a great look either.
No, it's not exactly right. In the meantime, we have a nominee for Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, who is a Native American. She's an American Indian that everybody really likes a lot, but she's getting some flack now over fracking, as it were.
Yeah, her position on fracking is kind of an interesting one, and she will definitely be cross-examined on just how fervent an opponent for fracking she is. And it's, especially in the wake of Texas, it becomes an even more important issue. On the other hand, Merrick Garland seems to be doing quite well in front of the Judiciary Committee. He got Chuck Grassley's endorsement, and even Lindsey Graham indicated he's going to vote in favor. So that nomination at least looks like it's going to go through.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in his prepared remarks and in his testimony, he really almost led with domestic terrorism, which he knows about because he oversaw the prosecution of a major domestic terrorism event. It's interesting he led with that, which I guess would appeal on both sides of the aisle at this point.
Yeah, and well, let's look at the context. This comes about 3 weeks after the insurrection on Capitol Hill by far-right groups. There have been 9 people indicted for that on the far right. So he's going to take that up as a real significant threat to U.S. democracy.
And for our Bloomberg purposes, if you take a look at his opinions, he has quite a track record on the D.C. circuit there. He actually has been pretty favorable to business.
Yeah, he has. And it's interesting the kind of support he's getting from both Republican and Democratic groups, which may mean he's done things right on both sides.
In the meantime, is there much resistance apart from Neera Tanden that you're seeing?
No, I don't think there is. And, you know, Ted Cruz had a few questions that were rather pointed about Obama's attorney general and how he would treat the office differently than Obama's AG. So he was able to skirt those questions pretty easily.
Okay, thank you so much. It's always great to have you with us. That's Bloomberg's Marty Schenker. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to the head of the American Natural Gas Association about the role gas played in the Texas energy crisis last week. It turns out that gas did not save Texas. The question is, was it part of the problem or can it be part of the solution? That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio.